Father Benedict was nearing the dusk of his life when he first heard unsettling rumors about the abandoned church in the countryside. Centuries old and long untouched by renovations, St. Agatha's church stood alone on a windswept plain. People in neighboring villages spoke of flickering lights through the broken stained glass windows at odd hours, or of distant moans carried on the night breeze. These stories found their way to Father Benedict's parish, where a few worried souls begged him to investigate. He was known for his expertise in matters of spiritual warfare, having assisted in several exorcisms during his decades of service. Although age and infirmity had slowed his steps, his resolve remained firm, and he resolved to see for himself what evil, if any, festered within those decaying walls. He arrived on a chilly autumn evening, traveling by a small hired carriage along an unpaved road. The driver refused to go all the way to the church, so Father Benedict walked the remaining distance, gripping his staff to steady himself. He paused at the weathered entrance gate, noticing rusted hinges and an array of warped boards that had once formed a fence around the property. The ground felt spongy beneath his feet, as though it had rained recently, and the tall grass shrouded gravestones leaning at precarious angles. He remembered hearing about a graveyard adjacent to the church, a final resting place for villagers who had once worshipped there. Legends claimed something unholy had laid claim to those grounds after a gruesome incident, though the specific details had been lost with time. Upon reaching the arched doorway, Father Benedict placed his hand on the iron handle and felt the chill seep through his gloves. He pulled firmly until the door gave way with a reluctant shudder. Inside, the nave stretched before him in gloom, the last scraps of daylight trickling through small breaks in the stained glass. Rows of pews stood rotting in place, lined with a fine film of dust. Near the altar, an imposing wooden ladder led up into a bell tower that was rumored to be the source of the uncanny events. Father Benedict recalled the gossip. Shapes drifting past the narrow belfry windows, disembodied voices calling for help, and a faint clang of a bell that no one had rung for decades. He felt a ripple of trepidation, suspecting he was in the presence of something far beyond a mere haunt. He moved slowly down the central aisle, his eyes adjusting to the dimness. In the far corner, a half-collapsed confessional stood with its curtain missing, revealing a single wooden stool. He was reminded of his younger days, when he had heard confessions in similar booths. Back then, he had never imagined that he would one day confront forces so malevolent they were said to twist reality itself. The quiet inside St. Agatha's was oppressive. With each hesitant step, he sensed he was being watched. He remembered reading about how certain malevolent entities drew power from silent fear and gloom, feeding on human dread as easily as beasts might feed on flesh. He cleared a small space near the altar and placed his belongings on a makeshift table formed by two stacked crates. From his satchel, he withdrew a worn Bible, a vial of blessed water, and a crucifix. He expected an aggressive response if a demon truly inhabited the premises. Such spirits loathed any sign of divine authority, and exorcists sometimes faced immediate retaliation. As he stood preparing himself through prayer, he considered the real possibility that his advanced age might limit his effectiveness. Nevertheless, he steadied his breathing and uttered silent supplications for strength beyond his years. He decided to ascend the ladder leading up to the bell tower. According to lore, the final meltdown of the congregation had taken place there long ago, when an acolyte had supposedly become possessed during a night service. The accounts were sketchy, but they spoke of savage violence, culminating in the acolyte plunging from the tower into the graveyard below. Since that night, no one had dared ring the bell or even climb to that loft again. As Father Benedict approached the ladder, a cold gust of air seemed to descend from above, as if warning him away. His heart pounded, but he gripped each rung firmly, determined to carry out the solemn rite if needed. At the top of the ladder, he emerged into a cramped loft with a single ancient bell suspended by chains. Moonlight seeped in through cracks in the stone, illuminating the scene just enough for him to see the battered edges of the bell and the thick spiderwebs that stretched across the beams. He felt an immediate sense of suffocation, as though the atmosphere held a wicked intelligence. An instant later, he spotted a shape lurking in a corner. no bigger than a person but contorted at an odd angle. It did not move, yet it exuded a dreadful presence. Father Benedict's pulse quickened, for he was certain that this was not a mere phantom, but a vessel for something sinister. He stood there for a tense moment, whispering passages of scripture under his breath. The shape in the corner twitched in response. He detected a guttural hiss that seemed to echo from the stone walls, though no mouth made the sound. He recalled from his studies that demons in such a state often revealed themselves only when provoked by holy words. That knowledge guided him, so he began the ancient formulas of exorcism, reciting them with deliberate calm. A sensation of malice pulsed through the loft, pressing against him like a tangible force. The shape moved again, revealing limbs that should not bend the way they did. Father Benedict refused to be shaken. He sprinkled blessed water in a wide arc, confident that a true demon would recoil if it were indeed occupying that twisted form. The hiss intensified, turning into a raspy shriek. He felt the wooden floor quiver beneath his feet. The rope attached to the bell swayed on its own, and the old metal gave a low, mournful toll. He persevered, extending his crucifix and invoking the holy power that it symbolized. The figure lurched forward, but as it reached the perimeter of his protective circle, it was forced back as though repelled by an invisible barrier. He continued the exorcism rites, his voice unwavering. For what felt like an eternity, the oppressive air pressed in on him, testing his resolve. The demon's presence struggled against the incantations, contorting the corner of the loft into a swirl of darkness. The building itself seemed to groan under the strain, as if the ancient stones might crumble from the unearthly conflict. Eventually, the shape let out a final, piercing wail that faded into silence. Father Benedict sensed a weight lifting. He watched in awe as the twisted form collapsed, leaving behind a withered husk that looked scarcely human. He descended the ladder after a long pause. His heart raced from the effort, and his body ached with exhaustion. Though not certain whether the entity was fully banished, he believed he had quelled its immediate power. In many exorcisms, complete eradication of evil was elusive, and further rites might be necessary. Yet he felt a profound calm settle over the old church. The air no longer felt as suffocating, and the silent gloom now seemed merely the hush of a building long forgotten, rather than a living menace. He returned to the altar, gathered his belongings, and offered a prayer of thanksgiving. Before leaving St. Agatha's, Father Benedict paused at the threshold and looked back across the shadowy pews. He wondered what would become of this lonely church now that the malevolent force had been weakened. Would a fresh congregation restore its fallen grandeur, or would it remain forsaken, doomed to crumble in solitude? He shut the heavy door behind him, leaving behind the memory of the withered shape in the bell tower, convinced that his duty in that place was, for the moment, complete. He made his way carefully through the overgrown graveyard, stepping around tilted headstones. The grass parted in the breeze, and he felt at peace, if only for a fleeting moment. The carriage driver was gone, having fled the area, rather than wait for the priest's return. Father Benedict walked slowly along the dirt road toward the flicker of distant village lights. Although his bones ached and his breath came in uneven spurts, he felt gratitude that he had at least attempted to free the old church from the grip of a dreadful spirit. In his quiet reflections, he accepted that exorcisms often brought only temporary relief, for evil tended to lurk at the edges of the world, ever ready to resurface. Still, he hoped the countryside would sleep more soundly that night, freed from the horrors that once lurked in the bell tower. He finally arrived at a modest inn just outside the village, stepping into the lamplit interior, where the innkeeper glanced at him with both curiosity and concern. Without revealing too many details, Father Benedict requested a small meal and a place to rest. Over a simple dinner, he felt a mixture of wariness and hope, uncertain if he would ever return to St. Agatha's. He bowed his head in silent prayer, asking that the demon not re-establish its hold on those sacred grounds. The hush in the common room offered no answer, yet he held on to faith that his calling remained necessary in a world still shrouded by the unknown. For now, the bell tower would keep its secrets, subdued if not fully cleansed, and he would carry on as best he could. Father Miguel served in the bustling city parish of St. Dismas Cathedral, a Gothic edifice renowned for its ornate spires and stunning stained glass windows. By day, the building shone with beauty and offered a refuge for thousands of worshippers. By night, however, its cavernous halls and towering arches took on a more foreboding quality. Whispers of a clandestine crypt beneath the main altar persisted among the faithful, though few ever ventured into those hidden passages. Father Miguel found these rumors unnerving yet intriguing. When a terrified mother arrived at his confessional claiming her daughter was afflicted by a dark spirit, he began to suspect the crypt might hold secrets he could no longer ignore. He agreed to visit the family's apartment in a decrepit tenement just outside the cathedral's shadow. The mother's tearful account of her daughter's sudden changes in temperament disturbed him. According to her, the girl had begun speaking in languages she could not have learned, cowering in corners and recoiling from crucifixes. Father Miguel decided to bring the child to the cathedral, believing a sacred space might help him confront the malevolent influence. He also resolved that if an exorcism was necessary, he would conduct it according to the strict rites of the church. Late one afternoon, he escorted the mother and her pale, trembling daughter through the cathedral's imposing doors. The girl appeared lethargic, though a flash in her gaze gave the priest a sense of impending hostility. He offered a short prayer, asking for the strength to unravel the darkness that clung to the child. After some hesitation, he guided them toward a rarely used corridor that led behind the altar. At the end of this hall, a locked gate opened onto the dusty staircase descending into the crypt. Few in the current parish leadership even knew this place existed, but old records alluded to tombs that housed church founders and historical figures. Father Miguel felt compelled to see if there was a connection between the child's condition and the cathedral's hidden recesses. Down in the crypt, the air felt stale, as though sealed away from sunlight for generations. Rows of time-worn sarcophagi lined the walls, carved with names that had faded. Father Miguel held a lantern, its glow flickering on the cold stone. He could see the mother's anxiety building, but he reassured her that the house of God remained a place of grace, even in its hidden chambers. The child, however, seemed energized by the gloom. She moved with unsettling grace, her wide eyes darting from one ancient tomb to another, as if greeting old friends. When she began speaking in a murmur that rose and fell with eerie rhythms, Father Miguel recognized it as a language of unknown origin. He steadied himself, recalling the classical signs of possession that he had studied but never before witnessed at such close range. He set the lantern on a low pedestal and opened a small prayer book he had taken from the sacristy. Though he had performed blessings in many contexts, a full exorcism demanded absolute conviction. He had to be certain that a demon was truly at work. Kneeling at the child's side, he spoke her name gently, attempting to coax her back into awareness. The child's eyes rolled, and a contemptuous smirk replaced the emptiness on her face. A guttural voice, far deeper than any child's voice should be, resonated within the crypt, mocking Father Miguel's words, and claiming the child belonged to a force older than the cathedral itself. The mother shuddered, her faith wavering in the presence of such malevolence. Father Miguel held a crucifix before the girl. The smirk turned into a sneer, and the creature controlling her twisted her body in an unnatural arch, as though trying to wrench itself away from the sacred object. He began the solemn invocation, reciting the time-honored lines that called upon divine intervention. At the mention of holy names, the child hissed. The echo in the crypt magnified the sound, giving the impression of multiple voices shrieking in unison. The old tombs seemed to amplify the tension. Father Miguel felt a chill creeping across the floor, as though an invisible presence moved around them. He did not waver in his prayers, for he knew that unwavering faith was crucial. He also remembered that some demons attempted to wear down an exorcist by dredging up personal doubts or hidden fears. True to form, the possessed girl's voice changed, calling out private details from the priest's past. She described his moments of hesitation about his vocation, the guilt he felt for not visiting his sick mother more often, the fleeting temptation that once made him question his vows. Father Miguel's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to remain calm and continue the rite. He recognized this tactic as a ploy to break his resolve. The mother attempted to comfort her daughter, though her trembling hands betrayed her terror. She begged Father Miguel to hurry. He turned a page in his prayer book and repeated the exorcism's most critical lines, urging the unclean spirit to depart. The child let out a howl that reverberated through every niche of the crypt. Then she collapsed onto the cold stone floor, breathing in ragged gasps. Father Miguel used the brief respite to anoint the child's forehead with oil, reaffirming the power of the church. A surge of malevolence rose again, and for a moment, the child's eyes glowed with a dull red cast. A rancid stench filled the crypt, and small pebbles on the ground trembled as if the earth itself reacted to the conflict unfolding in its depths. Confident that the demon's grip was weakening, Father Miguel forced himself to speak with absolute conviction. Invoking the names of saintly protectors, he demanded that the spirit relinquish the girl. When he sprinkled holy water, the child convulsed, choking out curses in an archaic tongue. The priest pressed the crucifix to the child's hand, continuing his formal exorcism prayers. Each verse seemed to push the spirit further to the edge. After a furious standoff, the demon let out a final, piercing shriek, as though yanked backward by an unseen force. The child's body went limp. Father Miguel sensed the oppressive weight in the crypt lifting, replaced by a cold stillness that signaled the demon's departure. In the aftermath, the mother embraced her daughter, who appeared exhausted and disoriented, but otherwise unhurt. Father Miguel helped them both to their feet and guided them back toward the staircase. The child murmured faint, scattered words, no longer in that unholy voice, but in her own uncertain tone. Relief washed over Father Miguel as he realized the exorcism had succeeded, at least for that night. He suspected the demon had been drawn by something unholy in the crypt's history, perhaps a sacrilege committed centuries earlier. Though exhausted, he felt resolute in his duty to see that no further evil would fester in that secret place. They returned to the main cathedral, where twilight now cast long shadows across the pews. Father Miguel promised to continue watching over the child, offering prayers and guidance to ensure the spirit would not return. The mother, overwhelmed by gratitude, wept softly. The child clung to her mother's arm, blinking away lingering confusion. As they departed through the massive doors, Father Miguel lingered behind, gazing down the dark corridor that led to the crypt. He silently vowed to seal the hidden catacombs for good, or ensure they were regularly blessed. A sense of calm had returned to the cathedral, but he knew that evil rarely surrendered forever. The memory of that archaic voice would stay with him, reminding him that some corners of the human soul, like some corners of St. Dismas Cathedral, remained vulnerable to shadows beyond mortal understanding. Rachel Hargrove was the last living heir to the Hargrove lineage, a bloodline tainted by dark rumors and whispered scandals. The ancestral estate, a sprawling mansion perched on a cliff near a perpetually storm-lashed coast, stood as a silent sentinel to the family's storied past. A labyrinth of corridors and hidden rooms filled the old house, each carrying a hint of the secrets that had accumulated over centuries. People in the nearby town seldom spoke openly about the Hargroves, but Rachel was well aware of the murmurs that branded her family cursed. She inherited the estate after her uncle's passing, who died under mysterious circumstances. When she arrived, she found the mansion in a state of oppressive decay. Dust coated every surface and wallpaper peeled away in curling sheets. She sensed a presence lurking in the corners, as though the house itself was watching her. In one of the parlors, she discovered a collection of antique journals, bound in cracked leather. Their pages chronicled the Hargroves' involvement in occult experiments, culminating in a deeply unsettling event. One passage described a pact forged by an ancestor who sought forbidden knowledge, promising unspeakable devotion to an entity that thrived on spiritual corruption. The words suggested that each generation risked inheriting a portion of that dark power. Troubled by these revelations, Rachel invited Father Hayes, a local priest with experience in exorcisms, to visit the estate. She hesitated to mention the details of her uncle's demise. The coroner's report was vague, implying a sudden, inexplicable seizure. But the hushed rumors claimed he had been found contorted in a posture of abject terror, eyes wide open as though he had witnessed something profoundly horrifying. Rachel felt compelled to learn whether a demonic influence might be tied to the house or, more chillingly, to her own lineage. Father Hayes arrived one overcast afternoon, his measured demeanor reassuring her that he would address whatever malevolence afflicted the property. As they began exploring, the priest spoke about past exorcisms, explaining that certain locations absorbed the energies unleashed by blasphemous acts. The more vile the trespass, the stronger the residue remained. Rachel led him to an old chapel room on the mansion's west wing, which had apparently been converted by one of her ancestors for clandestine worship of a figure they named simply the benefactor. Dusty pews were crammed together in a haphazard arrangement, and a makeshift altar stood at the far end, bearing an upside-down crucifix. Father Hayes paused there, quietly uttering a prayer. The air in that chamber felt dense, as though saturated with hidden resentments and unholy invocations from another time. Rachel felt a growing unease, followed by a dizziness that compelled her to lean against a wall for support. A fleeting sense of detachment overwhelmed her, as though she were caught between the present and some forgotten moment from the estate's sinister past. Father Hayes noticed her distress and began reciting a protective verse, suspecting she might be susceptible to the dormant evil that lingered in the house. She tried to dismiss the feeling as exhaustion, but her trembling limbs suggested otherwise. In the gloom of that makeshift chapel, she felt that she was not alone, that invisible eyes regarded her with insatiable curiosity. The priest concluded his brief prayer and led Rachel out of the chapel. He advised her to prepare for a ritual that might confront the estate's lurking force. If a demon had truly anchored itself to the Hargrove bloodline, it might attempt to possess the rightful heir. Rachel acknowledged that possibility, recalling half-remembered nightmares from her childhood about monsters in the house's hidden chambers. She agreed to let Father Hayes conduct a solemn exorcism in the central Great Hall, an expansive space with tall windows and tattered drapes that rustled in the slightest breeze. They arranged a table in the center of the Great Hall. Father Hayes placed a Bible, a crucifix, and anointing oils upon it. Rachel stood close by, feeling both anxious and determined. She remembered the journal's ominous words about the family's ancient pact, which had never been annulled. She feared that the cost of breaking it might be far greater than she dared imagine. The priest began with an invocation of divine protection, his calm voice carrying through the silent corridors. As he spoke, the temperature seemed to drop, and an uneasy tension pressed against the walls. Rachel recalled references in the journals to how the family once harnessed a demon's power for influence and wealth. Now, in her generation, the old entity might be awakening to claim what it believed was owed. She felt a creeping pressure in her head, like a swirl of unwelcome thoughts that clashed with her own. Father Hayes noticed her struggle and directed his prayers more forcefully. He reminded her that a demon often attempted to torment its host with illusions or guilt. When Rachel closed her eyes, she glimpsed ghastly images from the past. Robed figures chanting in the chapel, dark shapes painted upon the floors in blood, and a pale-faced man, her long-dead ancestor, raising a chalice in twisted devotion. She could almost smell the iron tang of sacrificed offerings, and she recoiled from the nauseating vision. She opened her eyes, gasping for air, determined not to let the presence claim her mind. Father Hayes continued the exorcism, emphasizing that the demon, if present, must renounce any hold it claimed over Rachel's lineage. He recited the ancient formula, calling upon higher powers to cleanse the estate of spiritual corruption. Rachel, in a trembling voice, denounced the family's hidden pact, rejecting all ties to the benefactor. Almost immediately, an overwhelming force buckled her knees, and she fell to the floor. Father Hayes rushed to keep her upright, pressing the crucifix gently against her forehead. Through clenched teeth, she spat words that did not feel like her own, cursing the priest and calling him a fool. He maintained his composure, accustomed to the horrifying rage that demons unleashed during exorcisms. A suffocating heaviness gathered in the hall, as though the entire mansion bore down on them. The windows rattled, and the tattered drapes whipped violently in some unseen wind. Rachel felt her consciousness flicker, as if she stood on the edge of oblivion. In that instant, she perceived a faint silhouette near the far corner, where the gloom was darkest. It seemed to watch her with hollow, unblinking eyes. Father Hayes raised his voice in the final segment of the exorcism, commanding the demon to depart and relinquish its claim. The silhouette drifted closer, and a whisper carried across the hall, urging Rachel to accept her destiny as the last Hargrove. She responded by pleading for mercy and begging the entity to leave. A tear slid down her cheek when she sensed the presence recoil. The hush that followed felt profound, as if time itself had paused to witness the outcome. Father Hayes finished the rite, then stepped back to gauge whether the malevolent force was truly gone. Although the hall remained dim and cold, he no longer sensed the oppressive weight he had felt before. Rachel's breathing stabilized. She no longer felt that creeping intrusion in her mind. Slowly, she rose to her feet, staring at the corner where the silhouette had lingered, now empty. She whispered a quiet prayer of gratitude, unsure whether the demon was banished or only momentarily repelled. Father Hayes assured her that if it attempted to return, he would conduct further rites to expunge it completely. In the waning light of evening, Rachel and the priest walked the corridors together. The mansion still felt eerie, but the threat of immediate possession had receded. Father Hayes advised her to remove the unholy objects from the chapel room. He suggested burning the upside-down crucifix, disposing of the rotted altars, and blessing every threshold to guard against a resurgence of evil. Rachel agreed, though she dreaded unearthing any further secrets. Nevertheless, she stood firm in her resolve to end the centuries-long hold the demon had claimed on her family. She no longer wanted to be bound by the sins of her ancestors. Father Hayes departed before nightfall, promising to return within a week to perform additional blessings. Alone among the dim hallways, Rachel felt an unsteady mixture of relief and loneliness. She understood that her responsibility extended beyond her personal safety. The estate's very architecture carried the residue of her forebears' wicked deals. She walked slowly to the chapel room, where the dust still clung to every surface. As she gazed at the inverted crucifix for what she swore would be the final time, she thought about how easy it was to inherit a legacy of darkness, and how hard it was to cast it off. Her heart beat steadily now, no longer out of fear, but out of a new determination to break the cycle. She believed her fight was not quite finished, but at least she knew where to begin. For the first time in her life, she felt a sense of genuine hope, tempered by the awareness that exorcisms rarely concluded with neat and certain endings.